When you think about the economy of Canada's Atlantic provinces, that is New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland and Labrador, what do you picture as their main industry? If you're not from there, your first guess might be fishing, right?
We're surrounded by oceans, so I understand that, but it's so much more than that.
That's David Chaundy. He's the president and CEO of the Atlantic Economic Council, a nonprofit economic research organization.
Certainly, there's no doubt the ocean does play a huge part, but when you look at fishing specifically, it's about 1.5 to 3% of our GDP in the 4 provinces. So it's a very diverse range of firms and sectors, both resource and non-resource based.
And though there are, of course, challenges, the region has taken on a new sense of economic vibrancy lately, thanks in part to COVID-era population shifts.
Absolutely. It's been a real sense of excitement and growth in Atlantic Canada that hadn't been felt in decades, I'd say.
That's Nicola Smith, Scotiabank's Atlantic Regional Senior Vice President. She and David are our guests this episode. With Scotiabank holding its 193rd annual general meeting in Halifax this month, we've asked Nicola and David to help break down the current state of the economy in Atlantic Canada. They'll bust some common misconceptions about the area and outline the region's challenges and opportunities. I'm Stephen Maurice, and this is Perspectives. David, Nicola, thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here.
Great to be here. Thank you.
All right, David, I'm going to start with you. You obviously are very well versed in this subject, and I understand the Atlantic Economic Council is going to be hosting a webcast shortly, essentially on this topic. So as difficult as it may be to summarize the entire economies of 4 separate provinces covering 2.5 million people or so, something like that, I'm going to ask you to give me sort of the brief overview of the Atlantic economy. How would you summarize what's going on in Atlantic Canada?
Sure. And maybe I'll just start with the sentiment of how Atlantic Canadians are feeling. And right now, I would say kind of worried, unsettled, uncertain, just because we are facing a major disruption in our trading relationship with the United States. That's been our biggest ally, our biggest export market. So the disruption with tariffs, potential tariffs, threats of tariffs, counter tariffs has really unsettled this region, as it has, I think, Canadians across the country. So that is certainly, I think, a mood that's impacting and shaping not just individuals, but businesses as they navigate how they respond. But if we just kind of step back from kind of that immediate, and not to want to downplay that in any way, but if you look back over the last 4 years, we've seen very strong population and economic growth across the Atlantic region. And that's actually been so strong, it's actually created some pressures just on our housing market, transportation systems, but we've really seen very strong population growth. And that has driven economic activity. And that's, I think, contributed to a sense of optimism and vibrancy. We haven't seen that population growth and that kind of internally driven growth for a long time. So it's given maybe that new sense of hope and like things are really changing here. And if we look across the region, I think we see a lot of the very same trends across the region. Certainly PI's had relatively strong population growth. It's been outpacing maybe some of the other maritime provinces. What tends to happen in Newfoundland and Labrador, because offshore oil is such a big part of that economy, and roughly about a third of its output. So when fields go offline or when fields come back online, that can certainly create some extra volatility. So they're expected to see stronger growth this year, but it's been weak the last couple of years. But I think, overall, it's a fairly similar trend. And then when you look at our cities and our rural areas, certainly the fastest growth economically and population has been in our bigger urban centers like Halifax, like Moncton, St. John's and Charlottetown. Certainly we're seeing some growth in our smaller communities. People are moving there as well. But certainly the growth drivers has been in those bigger cities, but they're only about half of our economy. Whereas people in Ontario, 80% of people are living in those big urban centers. It's only half of our population here, but we're still seeing that same drive, people moving to the cities, and that's where some of the strongest labor force and economic growth has been.
Right. Nicola, are you getting the same sense from your clients? What's your feeling about the general economic mood in Atlantic Canada?
I do agree with David's choice of worried or anxious, and I'd also add cautious to that description as well. This period of uncertainty created by the tariff threats has been felt deeply by many of our clients. Businesses are moving to a very cautionary stance, protecting cash flow, delaying investments, diversifying supply chains and trading partners where possible, really battening down the hatches, so to speak, while we wait for greater clarity on stability of trade. Individuals in the main are also showing more caution, particularly around large purchases. They're wanting to check in on their investments and are rallying behind Buy Atlantic and Buy Canadian.
Mm-hmm.
Scotiabank has deep expertise operating in North America and a proven track record in supporting our clients through periods of economic uncertainty. And we will continue to support our clients by providing the advice and expertise they expect from us at this time. That being said, and as David outlined, pre the current trade uncertainty, we have seen very strong population and economic growth in the Atlantic region. While clients are navigating a shifting economic landscape, in the main, they remain optimistic about long-term growth.
Okay. And reflecting a little bit what David said, sort of the growth that has happened over the last 4 years, and certainly we've heard about it in Toronto and in central Canada about people moving out to Atlantic Canada during the pandemic. What's been your feeling about the last 4 years? Again, sort of setting aside the current circumstances, but did you get a sense of sort of optimism in the region around its prospects, economic and otherwise?
Absolutely. David did touch on that vibrancy that we had been seeing up until the tariff uncertainties. It's been a real sense of excitement and growth in Atlantic Canada that hadn't been felt in decades, I'd say.
Right. David, I think traditionally many people in the rest of the country probably think of the Atlantic economy as being mostly or primarily about the fishing industry. To what extent is that true? How important are the fisheries? And what other industries would you say play a significant role in the Atlantic economy?
Certainly, there's no doubt the ocean does play a huge part. PEI and Nova Scotia are surrounded by ocean. New Brunswick and Labrador have big coastlines. So it's a big part of our culture. Certainly, when you look at fishing specifically, kind of narrow it down to that industry, yes, it's more important here in Atlantic Canada. It's 3 to 6 times bigger in our economy in Atlantic Canada than nationally. So that sounds really big. But when you look at the absolute numbers of, what's the contribution to our GDP or economic output, the measure we typically use, it's about 1.5 to 3% of our GDP in the 4 provinces. It's a relatively small share, much bigger than nationally, but it's still a small part of our economy. When you look at exports and kind of, what we're actually trading and selling, yes, it's a bigger share. It's about closer to 10% when you look at either live or frozen or processed lobster, crab, shrimp, and those types of seafood products, farmed salmon as well. So it is important. It's an important part of our export base, but it's really a very small part of our economy unless you're in those rural communities where it does obviously have a bigger part of driving their economic base, particularly in those seasons where they're fishing or seafood processing.
So the fishing industry maybe accounts for less than what many of us may have thought. What are the other industries that are driving the economy out there?
So when we look at other industries, certainly resources do play a role. So beyond the fisheries, we've got crude oil we export, we produce offshore, we have iron ore, we're mining copper and nickel in Newfoundland and Labrador. In New Brunswick, we've got pulp, paper, lumber, and other forest products from New Brunswick in particular, but other Atlantic provinces. We've got potatoes, both seed, fresh, and processed from New Brunswick, PEI. So resources still an important part beyond the fishery. But beyond that, Atlantic Canada hosts the biggest refinery in Canada, based in St. John. We have 3 fairly significant plants owned by Michelin, producing tires and other rubber products for export. Prince Edward Island, for example, has a thriving bioscience and aerospace repair and overhaul industry. And then across the region, you've got IT, digital technology firms in the life sciences, ocean technologies. And then just like Canada, whether it's services, whether it's tourism, engineering, education, retail, transportation, healthcare, national defense, those are also big employers in this region. So it is quite a diverse economy. And I know perceptions sometimes focus on 1 or 2 industries. We have that every time we ask kind of young students looking to work for us, what's the biggest fisheries, typically their answer. So I understand that. But when you look at the data, it's a very diverse economy. Certainly some sectors more important than others in certain provinces, but it's a very diverse range of firms and sectors, both resource and non-resource based.
Okay. And is there any particular sector that is kind of the growth area in Atlantic Canada that you would keep your eye on?
Well, we look at a fairly broad sector. Certainly, our resource sector is always important, and there's always opportunities there, particularly on the energy side right now. There's a lot of interest in developing new energy resources of all types. But certainly, I think that the technology side, whether it's IT, whether it's bioscience, whether it's clean technology, ocean-related technologies, that's where I think we see a lot of our growth potential going forward.
Nicola, you've been in Halifax for a while. I understand you're not originally from there. Did you come with some of those same preconceptions that we were talking about? Were you surprised by how diversified the economy is there or by anything else?
I think like many, I had heard about Atlantic Canada's strong sense of community and quality of life, and was certainly excited about the abundance of seafood we enjoy in the region when my family moved here. I would say what surprised me most was the level of economic diversification and innovation happening here. So while the region has historically been known for fisheries, tourism, and more traditional resource-based industries, as David has touched on, sectors such as renewable energy, technology, and healthcare innovation have been showing strong momentum. And I'd also call out the depth of collaboration between business, government, and academic institutions in driving innovation, particularly in the blue economy.
What does that mean, the blue economy, and how does it manifest itself in your area in particular?
I thought you might actually ask me this question. So I do have the World Bank's definition of the blue economy on hand. And what the blue economy is the sustainable use of ocean resources for economic growth, improved livelihoods and jobs, while also preserving the health of the ocean ecosystem. So a sustainable way to ensure that we are leveraging our oceans.
Right. You also mentioned the collaboration between business, government, and the academic world. Does that seem to be more significant there than you've seen elsewhere?
It did. I think it's absolutely happening in pockets all over the country. I found the coordination and the level of depth of that integration. I just hadn't had line of sight of it before coming here to Halifax and getting involved in the business community. And that rally cry around ocean technology and the blue economy and being a world leader in that respect is fantastic to see.
David, are you able to add to that? What are some of the things that people might be surprised about when it comes to the Atlantic economy?
Sure. Well, I think there's probably one perception that people have of Atlantic Canada, not only in terms of fishing and resource base, but it's that we have high unemployment rates.
Right.
That would be a fairly common perception of people outside of the region. There's some truth to it, but it's not really a full, accurate description. So if, for example, we look at unemployment rates in our urban centres, I'll just take Halifax for an example. The unemployment rate in Halifax last year was 5.5%. So, a fairly low rate, but that is actually lower than Toronto or Calgary, where you've got rates of closer to 8%. It's lower than Montreal, where they were closer to 6%. So that perception of this is a high unemployment region doesn't actually reflect the reality on the ground today. Where that perception does have some truth is when you look at our rural communities. And again, because they are fishing-based, seasonal, more resource-based, they do have high unemployment rates. And that, when you look at an average for the region or province, certainly that's where you get those higher rates. But when half of our population is in those urban communities, that's a more accurate description of what's really happening in our growth centers.
So is that like a historic perception? Because it's certainly what I would have remembered from years ago. You think about Atlantic Canada and you think about high unemployment.
Well, certainly unemployment rates have come down across the country and across the region. We've seen that decline from the 70s. But I think that reality in our urban centers has been that case for quite some time. But again, those historic unemployment rates in our rural communities, highly seasonal industries, I think that's been a big part of that historic perception. But as cities have grown, that's where we've seen a lot of strength, and those unemployment rates have come down as people have entered the labor market, moved to those cities, and that's where we've seen a lot of our growth and a lot of our vibrancy in our economy over the last several decades.
Okay. And you talked about the population earlier, some movement of population from west to east. Maybe you can elaborate on that a little bit more.
Sure. I think that anyone who's heard the news recently about the region has heard about, very strong population growth, and provinces have recorded, the record growth rates in decades. But when you look at the underlying demographics, our population is actually shrinking. We've had more people dying in this region than being born since around 2015. And until very recently, we were the only 4 provinces in Canada in that situation. So our underlying population is shrinking. What has contributed to the growth we've seen in recent years. Partly that we had this influx following COVID, people moving from Ontario and other places. That certainly provided some boost, but that's starting to taper off the last kind of year or so. And then we've seen a huge influx of people moving from other countries, as well as international students and temporary foreign workers. So we've really had that surge. And looking forward at our demographics, we are going to continue to see more people dying and being born. So to sustain our labor market, to sustain our economy, we continue to need to see people moving to this region. And just to give one example of that, you look at our labor market, for every 10 people retiring these days, we now have only 7 or 8 young people entering our labor market. Go back 30 years, for every 10 retiring, you had 20 young people entering our labor market. So those demographics are shaping not just senior care and schools, but it's really shaping our labor market. And that's what's really driving provinces and firms, employers, to focus on. We need to bring people into this region because we need a strong, viable economy. And to do that with our demographics, we really need to focus on immigration and attraction of people who want to come, contribute to our economy, and help make their homes here.
Right. So during that period of growth, when there were people moving from other parts of Canada, and overall in Canada, there's been a lot more immigration over the last few years, tapered off a little bit. So during that period, was that making up for the underlying shrinkage? Like, was there actual overall growth, or was it really just sort of keeping the numbers steady?
No, it was really contributing to growth. And I think part of the challenge of the last 3 or 4 years is the growth and the influx has kind of exceeded our capacity. It's put a lot of strain on our housing markets.
Right.
Apartment vacancy rates have gone down.
Right.
House prices have shot up by over 50%, depending on the city. And so it's really created some challenges because we're just not used to that much growth and that much influx of population. But going forward, we will need to see a steady influx of people into this region. Maybe we don't want it at quite that higher level. We need to make sure we can build homes. We need to make sure we can accommodate people in this region. But this region is going to need to continue to attract people to replace the people that are not being born here. We really need to ensure that we have a vibrant labor force for our economy's health going forward.
Right. Yeah, I mean, those are problems that exist in many parts of Canada, of managing an aging population, but then also trying to accommodate influxes of newcomers from elsewhere. Nicola, what are some of the repercussions that you feel around that shift in population that you hear from your clients?
I agree with everything that David said about the challenges in the labor market. I do hear directly from clients across all 4 provinces with regards to challenges in attracting and retaining the right talent to assist them in growing and sustaining their businesses. So the federal pullback in immigration, while necessary through the lens of ensuring that we've got housing stability and service stability for our existing and growth population, it is placing challenges on industry to ensure that we can attract and retain labor. And in addition to provincial programs, many employers have their own programs around attracting individuals, be it from elsewhere in Canada or internationally, into Atlantic Canada to ensure that we can have that growth in our labor market at a pace needed to ensure success for the region.
Okay. And we're just about wrapping up here, but I have a couple more questions. The first one I want to pose to both of you, and David, I'll start with you. Can you tell us what you think is the biggest challenge facing Atlantic Canada from an economic perspective? And what's the biggest opportunity?
So let me maybe start with the opportunity, which can also be a challenge. As we discussed earlier, this is a fairly resource-rich region, as many other parts of Canada are. And I think that, the opportunity for this region is to ensure we can fully develop and leverage those resources. Increasingly, we're seeing Indigenous participation in those resource developments like wind and various other energy projects through partnerships and joint ownership. But the world needs food. The world needs access to energy. It needs access to critical minerals and building supplies. And we have in this region, just as many other provinces in Canada, fisheries, food resources, forestry. We have critical minerals. We have offshore oil. and we have mining resources. So I think the opportunity for us is how do we further develop, how do we further scale up, discover and develop new resources. We're looking at wind power, both onshore, potentially offshore, new hydroelectricity from Newfoundland and Labrador. So there's lots of energy and other resources that the world needs right now. That's, I think, the opportunity, but also a challenge. How do we ensure that we can develop those projects? When I think about the biggest challenge for this region, I go to the non-resource sector and I think about, we have a lot of very successful technology firms in this region. We have profiled at our business outlet conferences a number of very successful firms that always leave me feeling, wow, these are world leaders. And we just don't seem to have enough of them at scale. We have a number of very successful firms in this region, a number of success stories. We have Verifone, which is a financial technology provider, now owned by NASDAQ. In PI, we have BioVectra, a large, successful pharmaceutical and biotech manufacturing company. We have a seafood company called Clearwater, which is now 50% owned by Indigenous companies. Some of our big utilities like Fortress and Emera, headquartered here, own assets across Canada, the United States and North America. We have Sobeys on the retail side, McCain's, Irving, like some of these family names that people would probably recognize. So we have many of these big, large companies. The question is, how do we get more of those? How do we scale up our firms so that they have that capacity to be world-class at scale, whether they're resource-based or whether they're technology-based? To me, that's our biggest challenge in this region. How do we get many startups and mid-sized firms into that level where they've got that scale to really have that competitive advantage on the global scale? Because, economies of scale certainly matter. We've always been challenged with relatively small firms in Atlantic Canada. We've got a relatively small population compared to Ontario or British Columbia. So how do we get scale in our firms so that they can showcase their technologies and really develop those homegrown, world-leading firms, as we've seen with some of those examples that I just mentioned?
Right. Nicola, can I turn to you for challenges, opportunities?
Absolutely. I'll start with my one big challenge, and that would be productivity. In this context, I'm talking about productivity as a measure of our economic output as a province or region. It's often reported as GDP per capita, so our economic output divided by our population. On this measure, Atlantic Canada lags the rest of the country and the U.S. And the risk that this can pose over time is downward pressure on wages and overall reduced living standards. Mm-hmm. In order to increase productivity, we need to continue to grow and attract strong talent, which we've spoken about from a labor market perspective. We need to invest in making our workforce more efficient, and we need to embrace technology and innovation. I think the current trade uncertainty, we definitely see that slowing productivity investments at the individual business level, and that's a challenge. However, over the long term, the need is clear and recognized in the region and will require focus from all levels of government and the private sector to move the needle. On the opportunity side, I'll focus on the Atlantic Canadian culture and green shoots we are seeing in technology and innovation. On culture, Atlantic Canadians are unassuming, hardworking, and resilient. They're proud and passionate about supporting their community. They've weathered many storms, and they will weather many more. On the green shoots in technology and innovation, Atlantic Canada is well positioned to be a leader in renewable energy projects, including offshore wind, clean tech, as David's also touched on. The rise of fintech, AI, and the blue economy are creating new economic opportunities across the region. And the region's entrepreneurial ecosystem is expanding with increasing support for startups and innovation-driven businesses. So there's still lots to be optimistic about.
Okay. My final question is for you, Nicola. Scotiabank, of course, was founded in Nova Scotia almost 2 centuries ago and will be holding its 193rd annual general meeting in Halifax in April. What does that history mean to the bank and to how it's viewed in Atlantic Canada?
The bank absolutely was founded in Halifax, Nova Scotia in 1832. We were Canada's first public bank, established as an alternative to the privately owned banks of the time, highlighting our commitment to financial inclusion from the start. So the bank's legacy is intertwined with the region's economic evolution, from early regional trade and commerce to the diverse international reach of the region today. Bringing our AGM back home to Halifax reaffirms our commitment to the region and highlights our continued role in supporting Atlantic Canada's economic resilience and growth. Over the years, Scotiabank has been a key partner in regional development, supporting businesses and infrastructure through public and private sector financing support, and importantly, investing in our communities. And most recently, we're doing that through our Scotia Rise initiative, which is our 10-year, $500 million commitment to help people reach their potential.
Nicola, David, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
I've been speaking with Nicola Ray Smith, Scotiabank's Atlantic Regional Senior Vice President, and David Chaundy, President and CEO of the Atlantic Economic Council. The Perspectives podcast is made by me, Stephen Maurice, as well as Armina Lagaya and our producer, Andrew Norton. For a transcript of this episode, as well as other stories, insights, analysis, and thought leadership, visit our website, scotiabank.com/perspectives. We'll see you next time.